Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Market Performance and Planning Forum. My name is Brenda Corona, representing in behalf of California ISO from Stakeholder Affairs Group, and we'll welcome you here to our quarterly meeting that we will be discussing many topics for this year. As a quick reminder, this quarterly forum is going to be recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Additionally, for these comments that are being asked during the call, please refrain from repeating or make comments brief so we can move on to the next topic. And we will go over the how to raise your hand icon here below. So to virtually participate during this call, you will have to select the raise hand icon in the lower bar. You'll see it once you hear a beep tone, you'll be unmuted. So be sure to state your name and affiliation when asking your question. Also, my technical assistant, Michelle, will be available for any questions. And then also, there's also a do not mute yourself when you're asking the question. So make sure you complete your question because the WebEx platform will lock you and mute you once you mute yourself. So that's a new feature. Just want to give everyone a heads up on that. So make sure you complete your question before muting yourself. As well, for this objective in today's call, we plan to share updates for 2023 release plans, and then we're going to go over the agenda on a few topics for the market performance. Most of these objectives are the standard objectives for every meeting, but we do plan to announce other topics related to market performance. So we'll go over that. And then as a reminder, policy discussions that should occur during the stakeholder process. So if you do have any questions in regarding to any of the policy initiatives, feel free to visit our website for that information for the upcoming meetings and deadlines. So for today's agenda, we will go ahead and kick things off for the first topic that will be the Operation Procedure 4420 System Emergency. And this is an update to the Strategic Reliability Reserve Program. That will be about 2-3 slides. And then we will go ahead and pass it on to our market analysis and short-term forecasting team. And they'll be covering about 5 topics listed here below. Some of these topics are newer than the ones I mentioned earlier this week in our agenda. We have AS scarcity, flexible ramping product, performance, low conformance, assistant energy transfer, and lastly, storage resources, CRRs, market forecasting metrics. So these topics will take most of the time of the meeting, so we will keep an eye out for questions as well move along to allow the presenters to go over their material. And then after the market performance update, we will go to the policy update, and we do have Alyssa Craig, Arnold, who will be providing those updates for today's meeting, and then we'll pass it on to Trang to end us with a release update. But with that, I think we can go ahead and get started. Michelle, let's see, we have our first topic, and I believe Christy will go ahead and kick things off for us today.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Christy Sonata, Manager of California Regulatory Affairs at the ISO. I'm going to frame this next discussion, and then I'll turn it over to Tricia and our operations group to go over some of the specific updates to our Operating Procedure 4420, which covers system emergencies. So just to frame the conversation, this year, the CAISO made several updates to our system emergency Operating Procedure 4420. Their updated procedure was posted last Thursday on June 22nd. In this discussion, we are going to focus on the 4420 updates that are specific to the state's electric supply strategic reliability reserve program, or strategic reserves. The updated 4420 now includes details on how the ISO will operationalize generators that are part of the state strategic reliability reserve program and the state's power augmentation project, or SPAP, both overseen by the Department of Water Resources. So we'll refer to these and referred in the operating procedure collectively as the strategic reserves. So as a reminder, some of the assets in the strategic reserve are available for use by any California balancing authority area, not just the CAISO BA. However, operating procedure 4420 is limited to the CAISO's operational perspective in our processes. So we will go over some specific updates shortly, but at a high level, operating procedure 4420 does now include details on both the operation of short and long start strategic reserve assets that are generators in the CAISO markets. So I will turn it over to Trisha now to go over some of the specific details and updates that are in 4420.
Thank you, Christy. Next slide, please. So the major changes for 4420 for this summer, as Christy mentioned, is the addition of the Strategic Reserve Resource Program. And there are two types of resources that are identified in the 4420 procedure. There is the long start SSRs, which would need instructions from the ISO to get started 1 to 7 days before the operating day, depending on the startup time requirements. Currently, there's only one resource that's actually referenced in 4420 that's in this long start category, but in the future there will be additional. And the idea with these is that the instructions are to bring the resources online at PMIN for the range of dates and times forecasted for the event, and then we have time also in that time range to initiate a test if needed, if there hasn't been recent testing for the resource. And throughout the event, the resource will manage availability between outages and bids. And then at the end of the event, then we would issue shutdown instructions. So the fast start resources are a little bit more straightforward, where for each operating day, scheduling coordinator should have bids submitted, and they would be managing availability through outages. So when the ISO issues EEA notifications, so a watch or EEA 1, 2, or 3, the scheduling coordinators adjust availability accordingly through the environmental restrictions outages to make those bids available to the market for those periods. Next slide, please. Thank you. The other part 4420 procedure addresses is if a sudden onset event occurs where we might be in a situation where the scheduling coordinators, it takes some time to get those availability timeframes adjusted in the outages, and in order to make the timeframes for the market, there could be a little bit of lag, and so in those cases, we would move as quickly as possible, but there could be potential exceptional dispatch depending on the type of event that we're contending with and how quickly we need those resources to respond. And then for transmission emergencies, there are some specific SRR resources which have been identified that can help with transmission emergencies, either in local areas or for system-wide transmission emergencies. But in those cases, we would use exceptional dispatch instructions, so those are covered in the transmission emergency section of the procedure, just so the resources know that they're specifically needed to help mitigate that situation. Next slide, please. Okay, that's all for my update.
Hi, Christy and Trisha. We do have a few questions on the queue. Let us know if you want to go ahead and take those. So we have Seth Cochran. Go ahead, Seth. Please introduce yourself and your affiliation, and don't mute yourself after you speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is Seth with DC Energy. I have a few questions. One is when these resources that are, I guess, targeted to be online during EA watch and the subsequent EA levels, they go to offer into the day-ahead market, into the real-time market. Are there any floors on the offer levels, or are they just? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, so it would be as determined by agreements and contracts, and subject to our tariff. So yeah, we're not privy to how the resources are bid. That's ultimately determined by the scheduling coordinator and pursuant to any agreements with the counterparty.
Okay, so they're effectively going to bid their cost. And so you could be in a situation where some high heat rate gas units are on, and then these guys come in and say their cost is lower. I don't know if that's true, but I'm wondering what impacts this would have on price formation. And essentially, if you were running up the stack and prices were going up, according to the heat rates and the gas prices, and then these guys came in and undercut them, prices would go down. And what you have here is a sort of a do loop where that would just erode the rode the price signal and you'd need more of these resources. And it's sort of it could end up in a complete market breakdown in the long run. Does that make sense?
So we do hear the concerns and dynamics and how there could be market impacts. We aren't planning to take up any of the market design or the policy discussions on this call, but we have flagged that our price formation initiative is kind of that right place to discuss any issues or market impacts with the strategic reserve. So I would direct those questions there, but
okay.
We do hear you.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's just such an easy way to do this. You just put a price floor in at the cap, which is what Texas style design is when there's a market intervention. Those go to the back of the stack. So it's not terribly complicated, but I'll save that for the price formation initiative.
Thanks, Seth.
Great, thanks, Seth. And next we do have Dennis from NCPA. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Dennis.
This is Dennis Sismet, Northern California Power Agency. During the most parts of the year where there isn't an EEA issued, how should we manage these SRRs? Should we continue to have an environmental restriction outage card showing zero availability for the resource?
So CDWR, as the owner, I guess, for the resources, should be communicating their expectations with the scheduling coordinators. But that's our assumption, especially, I mean, right now we're into the summer season, and we know that that's the expectation, I think, from CDWR currently, but Christy, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe CDWR would provide the guidance on that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Christy, just double checking. Are we good to move on? I think, one more question just popped up. Mark Smith from Calpine. Let's go ahead.
Folks, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good, thank you. I just wanted to say thanks for your flexibility when you were recrafting 4420 with regard to these things. We're in, I think, what are very productive discussions with DWR in order to accomplish the goals that I think the ISO and DWR are trying to get here. So again, from Calpine, thanks for your flexibility as you move forward with this. My only remaining concern is, associated with bidding these resources at a marginal cost or at a very low price, and how that will interfere with other dispatch procedures, for instance, for demand response. But we'll continue to work on that issue as time goes forward. Again, thanks for your flexibility in finalizing this rule as it relates to the fast start peakers. And thanks, Trish.
Thank you, everyone. So we can go ahead and move on to our next topic. Thank you so much, ladies, for the following topics, Christy and Tricia. So we can go ahead and kick things off for the market update, market analysis, short-term forecasting. So Amber, I do see you on my panelist. Would you be kicking us off for this first few slides?
For the first few slides, I will pass it to Abhishek to kick us off, and I see Guillermo joined as well. So they'll take the first few slides, and then I'll jump in as we get to a couple more forecasting related updates on slide 37.
Thank you, Amber. Okay. Abhishek, you're on double mute, just letting you know.
Actually, Brenda, it's Jenny Araj for this topic.
Okay.
Okay. Everyone, my name is Jenny Araj. I'm with the Market Validation team, and I'm going to talk about the 2020 to 2022 Ancillary Service Scarcity Event Report that has been posted. So just some background on what ancillary service scarcity is. It's a market mechanism that we've had in place since 2010, and prices automatically rise to a set of what we call administrative AS scarcity prices, and we can't procure our target requirements. So if we had, you know, a 500 megawatt requirement for reg down, and we could only procure 400 of that, the reg down price would automatically be set to $700. And those prices are detailed in our market operations BPM. And when those events do, we also send a market notice just to highlight that we were in a tight situation there. So along with the mechanism that runs every market run, there is a tariff requirement to review the AS pricing every 3 years to determine if we need any changes to the pricing mechanism. So the report that's been posted most recently covers the years 2020, 2021, and 2022. And there's past reports going all the way back to 2013 located on our website. So some highlights in the most recent report. Okay. So the highest number of events was in 2020, and most of those events were during the August and September heat wave. And 27% of those total annual events occurred during that time. And when we are going into staged emergencies, we are going to start deploying our operating reserves and not meeting our operating reserves requirement, and instead, you know, use that for energy. So that was the cause of that increase in events. But since then, in 2021 and in 2020, the events are very low. You can see there are no day-ahead events in any of these 3 years, and the real-time events are very, very low. And last year in 2020, we only had 6 real-time events, that's 6 15-minute intervals where we couldn't procure our targeted requirement. Just to detail out some of the reasons why we get into these situations, and mainly it is in that real-time market where we are more constrained, where we only have the resources that are bidding into that market and can be started in a very short amount of time. So the top reasons impacting our ability to procure ancillary services, well, if we have a resource outage or a PMIN re-rate on a resource that, for instance, had like a large amount of day-ahead ancillary services, and now they're on outage in real time, we have to go re-procure all of that ancillary services in real time, and that can be the cause of a scarcity event. And then, as I highlighted, we also have system conditions where we need the energy instead of maintaining our operating reserves, and you can see that, you know, 40 of those events were in 2020 with those August and September heat waves. We can also just have an increase in the AS requirements in the real-time market that can either be initiated by our operators or by maybe some increase in VER volatility. And, telemeter limits reducing resource capacity, that's much like a PMAX D rate that's just communicated through telemetry rather than our outage management system. We also have events where there is a transmission issue and our operators do not want ancillary services from certain resources behind a constraint, because that would exacerbate the transmission issue in the area. So that can be the cause. And there can also be MSG issues when they're in a transition or in a different configuration, and we sometimes can't get the ancillary services we are expected. And now with storage units, we did have some state of charge issues early on in 2020. We've put in some policy initiatives and market mechanisms to better manage state of charge in our procurement of ancillary services since then. So you can see that's not a big cause of events in more recent years. So to summarize the most recent report, we think there's a low frequency of area scarcity events, and that reflects that there are sufficient resources available and bidding into the ISO markets. We did make a small update to the demand curves in 2021. When we complied with Work Order 831, there are some very limited conditions where we raise our energy bid cap from $1,000 to $2,000. And when we are in those conditions where we have a new energy bid cap of 2,000, the demand curves, the AS demand curves also double in magnitude. So my example from the beginning, if the reg down scarcity event was 700, it would be a $1,400 price during those conditions. And so with that, we don't see a need to change the AS pricing at this time. And so that was the conclusion of our report, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Jenny. I don't see any questions in queue, so we can go ahead and move on to the next topic. Go ahead, Guillermo.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay. Before we go into the matter of the topics, as you may have seen, there is a lot of material for this session. It is in total over 200 slides. Naturally, we cannot go into every single detail given how vast the material is going to be today, and we have to cover 3 main sections. There are some metrics that we put there for completeness, so we will try to do our best to try to glance through some of those, but don't expect to go in details for every single one. And there is a set of key topics that we want to discuss with you. Jenny already covered the one for AS. That is something always meaningful to see how much scarcity we are dealing with on the AS market. The subsequent topics, some of those are standard updates that we have provided before, and some of those are indeed kind of new or continuations of policy discussions we have had now that we have implemented some features. And some topics like this one, the load conformance, is a very standard topic that typically comes in different forums because it touches effectively many aspects of the functioning of the market. And that is the reason we found important to give you some update, what's going on, how we are approaching this. In the past, to different efforts in the policy space, we have heard clearly the concerns about the utilization of load conformance. We recognize that it is a trade-off between having this last resource for addressing and aligning the market with the reality of the system and the potential implications that this may have in the well-being of the market. And I can tell you that from the last summer assessment that we did in 2022, we start working on addressing load conformance and the root causes, the drivers for requiring to have that conformance. Some features are regarding operations, some other features are regarding the functioning of the market. And as you may recall, for instance, the utilization of the load conformance in some cases has become the alternate for the flexible ramping product. The nodal market that we implemented back in February 2023, in large part was to overcome the complication, the limitation that we found regarding the stranded capacity for FRP due to congestion that hindered the efficacy of the flexible ramping product. Now that we have the product in place and we start to assess how it's working and potentially the implications that this may have in the utilization of the load conformance in the CAISO market. Let me start first with this topic, load conformance, and we can then jump naturally into the topic of the FRP. This information that you have in this slide was presented as part of the September 2022 summer evaluation that we did. And one of the components was specifically the utilization of load conformance in the RUC, in the reliability unit commitment process that is part of the day-ahead market. In some days during this critical heat wave, there was load conformance, RUC adjustments is what we call them, in the range of up to 10,000 megawatts. That the 10,000 may have fallen outside the critical window, but even in the critical window, the values that we saw were up to almost 9,000 megawatts. And that posed the question, why such a need to have that massive ROC adjustment? We provided transparency how that ROC adjustment of 9,000, 8,000 was derived, and how the composition of that megawatt was coming from. And we highlighted the components that we provide as a guidance to operators to account for the load, the wind, the solar uncertainty, and also the solar movement that is so critical in the evening ramp period. And this is how, when you pile up all these components, you reach this level of 9,000 megawatts. We recognize that it was not ideal to have these non-coincidental uncertainty components added together. And indeed, in the verbiage that we put in the report, we indicated that we were exploring and targeting to see if we could move from that current practice into something more sophisticated, and effectively to start using what we call the imbalance reserve approach that we have been discussing through the day-ahead market enhancement. That imbalance reserve approach would be a more sophisticated, superior way to estimate the uncertainty, all coincidental for the extreme conditions. And we are continuing to explore that possibility. That was the genesis of this assessment that we took after the summer 2022. Next slide, please. And let me tell you what we have been doing. This is a trend that captures in a very simplistic way the ROC adjustments that we have for the ROC process. This is part of the day-ahead market. And it's a simple daily average megawatt. Sorry, this is the HASP. Sorry, this is still the ROC process. The label of the plot is wrong. We should say daily ROC conformance. And it has several salient points that are important to highlight. We have been using these ROC adjustments consistently day to day, not only for the summer conditions, based on these components of uncertainty. Then we, as part of the 2023 goals that we have, we plan to have this pilot program to start really going deep in understanding the needs and the drivers for these ROC adjustments. So on trading date April 11, we ran a pilot in which we put no ROC adjustment in the day-ahead market. We just let the load forecast to sink in and see the consequences of not having that adjustment at all in the market. And we did the assessment, and I'm going to elaborate on that later. Then we digested the outcomes, what we saw, and then we repeat the test. So on May 4th, we again ran the day-ahead market with not load conformance, no adjustment for that trading day. And we assessed, and based on these two scenarios, we were clear to effectively change the practice for ROC adjustments, at least for this period of the year, that is the shoulder months and low load conditions. And that practice has changed to be, rather than consistently using the uncertainty components day to day as the guidance for the ROC adjustments, we stop altogether putting the ROC adjustments as long as the load doesn't exceed 35,000 megawatts. That is a practical threshold based on observations from the actual operations of the system, where we can feel confident that not having the ROC adjustment doesn't pose a risk for positioning resources properly for the real-time market. As you can see, starting on May 6th, we changed the practice, and the fact that you don't see any data starting with May 6th is not the fact that we are missing the data, it's the fact that there is no ROC adjustments applied to the day-ahead market. And we have been running that basically for 1.5 months, and we continue to assess to see how the day-ahead market is positioning resources for the real time, what complications, what new challenges may arise now that we don't have that rock adjustment in the day-ahead market, and see how the real time is indeed operating. This is one piece of the equation. And next slide, please. When you see the profile, because it's also critical to understand at what time of the day we are impacting the profile. Well, in some cases, you can see the dotted line, the thick dotted line for June. It's across the 24 hours. We basically collapsed to zero the rock adjustments for the whole month of June. May still shows a non-zero profile for most of the day, because there were some days at the beginning of the month that has a typical profile that takes the shape of the load, and that is the reason you still see some non-zero values for the light dotted line of May. And then the previous months, these are the months where it was just a standard business as usual, using the components day to day and coming with that predefined value for the rock adjustments. And it's important to see the highlight that it makes a difference when the adjustment is applied. Next slide, please. Now moving into the real time. The load conformance also applies to the real time. It's the same mechanism, and it can apply to the HASP, the hour ahead scheduling process, the 15-minute process, FMM, or indeed to the balancing market on 5-minute basis, the RTD. This profile that you have here is again a daily average of the load conformance applied to the HASP process. This is potentially the most impactful market where the conformance makes a difference, because this is a time where we can secure or redefine the mix of the interties. That is the last opportunity to rebalance interties. It's also an opportunity to commit additional resources that are within the real-time horizon. And what you see here is the trend over the same period of time. In addition to not using rock adjustments when loads are under 35,000 megawatts, we have been running a pilot program to try to minimize judiciously the load conformance in the real-time market. And the declining trend that you see most markedly in the end of May, beginning of June, is a reflection of that we are explicitly, intentionally bringing down the load conformance and see the consequences, how the market continues to operate, how tight operations may run by the time we have to be balancing the market to recalibrate the need. So it's not black and white as the day-ahead market that we did it starting in early May. This is more based on conditions, and therefore you can see that there are cases that we still have some level of conformance. We can get a better sense of the profile of the reduction of the conformance in the next slide, please. And the same profile. This is the profile of the conformance for specifically for the HASP market. And you can see month to month how the conformance has been applied. And the most significant ones are going to be the ones for May and June, when we have started this explicit intent to reduce the load conformance. And the profile shows that quite clearly. You can see that from anywhere up to 2,400 megawatts in the peak hours of March or February, we have come down to less than 900 megawatts for the month of June. And again, this is more surgical, it's not black and white, because we have to react to realize that conditions in the real time are dynamically changing, and therefore the need for that conformance is more surgical to identify how much we can go down. We are going to continue to do this type of assessment and to find first all the drivers that are driving the need for the utilization of the load conformance and bring these issues to a resolution. That, in combination with the implementation of the FRP and the continuous expansion of the constraints that we enforce on that feature, should start to make a difference, and we will be reporting on that. Now, this is the bigger picture. Let me go into some more details of how this works to give you the color of what are the implications of not having that adjustment in the market. Next slide, please. The first one, let me go back to the first day when we implemented the pilot of no adjustments in the day-ahead market. Here you have the comparison with the adjustment that would have been applied if we were to use it. The line in green is the one that would have the conformance applied, and you can see how it increases the demand needs, and indeed shifts the peak for 1 hour before. And we're talking about an avoidance of up to 2,400 megawatts of conformance that was not applied on that day. Next slide. Once we had applied that conformance, the ROC process is going to procure that additional capacity by different means. And here is where it becomes very interesting. And keep in mind, this is a reference of the pilot for a day in April that is typically a shoulder month. We are not dealing with very extreme loads. These are mild level of demand. So what you have by having conformance in the ROC process is additional supply. How the market provides for that additional supply depends on the conditions of effectively every day. And here you have different components. The first one is that for early hours of the day, the utilization of the conformance effectively required to have less oversupply for these early hours. Hour ending 13 through 16, 17 is still when we have full production of solar, quite meaningful contribution from solar, and therefore it's not unusual that we run in the long side of supply. When we increase the demand because of the ROC adjustment, all what we are doing is being able to absorb that excess generation by the load conformance. So we are not bringing additional resources. We already have plenty of supply. It's just reducing the condition of oversupply. And then for later hours, the most critical hours, hour ending 18 and 19, yes, we have incremental capacity, additional capacity in the ROC process to clear against that additional conformance. And that goes up to the range of 2,400 megawatts. The color code indicates the nature of the supply additionally provided in the ROC process to meet that ROC adjustment. As you can see, the blue one is additional commitments implemented in the ROC process to meet that additional demand. There is also incremental capacity, the bars in gray, and also very minor changes for the net schedule interchange, and that is expected. And because we rebalance the power, naturally we may have some movement of the losses in the system. Next slide, please. Another consequence of having this conformance is that there is indeed some movement for later in the day. The market is a complex machine, and there are many intertemporal constraints. So conditions, actions, decisions made for some hours are going to have consequences for subsequent hours. And in this case, what happens is that by having additional commitments in hour ending 18 and 19, these, or at least some of those units additionally committed in those hours, may need to keep running because they need to meet their intertemporal constraints. Now, in order to compensate for that additional supply for later hours in the day, we have to deck incrementally other resources online so that you can remain with basically zero balance. That is the line that you have in there. And that is exactly what happened, right? We committed additional units for hour ending 18, 19, and some of them required to remain online for the rest of the day, potentially leading to oversupply for later hours of the day. Next slide, please. Out of this capacity, if you highlight the portion in gray, that is incremental capacity. That means in the ROC process, all what we did is to move these resources to an upper operating point. They were already committed. It was a matter of moving incrementally in the variable range. This is effectively capacity that is not materially gained by having the ROC adjustment, because that capacity is already available, will be available in the real time. Next slide, please. If we now focus on the capacity that is committed, and we take out the incremental, the intertie, the NSI, the losses, only on the commitment capacity. There are two types of capacity that the ROC process can provide. One of them is what we call ROC non-binding. For instance, the ROC process may start up a fast start unit that may take 10, 15 minutes to start up. Even though it was a solution from the ROC process, we are not going to make that commitment binding because it has a short start. It can be re-optimized in the real-time market. And if that unit is needed, then the real-time market has the opportunity, has the time to be able to commit that unit. Therefore, there is no binding implications by ROC committing that unit. The pieces that matter are the bars with blue, because these are ROC binding. That means the day-ahead market is the only and last opportunity for the market to commit these units, and when they come into the real time, they have to be online. So there is no re-optimization in the real time. The capacity in blue is effectively the additional capacity that was gained by having the ROC adjustment. And out of the 2,400 megawatts, you can see for our ending 18, only 600 megawatts was materially gained capacity from the ROC process and the ROC adjustment. That would be about 25% of the total ROC adjustment. Next slide, please. So that is from the perspective of the day-ahead market. Before I open this for questions, let me cover quickly the real time. All what I described is what if we would have used the ROC adjustment. The reality is we didn't use it. So all this dynamic didn't happen. This is the capacity that we didn't gain. So we didn't gain this 600 megawatts of additional ROC binding capacity committed in the day-ahead process. So now the real time will not have that capacity. And we could expect that if that capacity was not present to start with in the real time, potentially now there may be additional needs to true up this in the real time. Is there any need to do additional things in the real time to compensate for the capacity that was not already given from the day-ahead market? One natural reaction would be, well, if I don't have that capacity gain in the day-ahead market, I will try to secure additional capacity as soon as I can in the real-time market. And the first opportunity for that is the HASP process. So we look at the HASP conformance. Did we have extremely different or fairly different profile and needs of the load conformance in the HASP process to compensate for the lack of capacity coming from the ROC process? And here you have a comparison of the profile for that day in red versus adjacent days. And you can see that the profile is kind of in the same ballpark. We didn't have higher levels of conformance. The profile in the time of the day seems to align relatively well, even though there is a conformance for later hours in the day. But generally speaking, we don't see a material difference in the utilization of the load conformance due to the lack of the ROC adjustments and the capacity from the day-ahead market that was not gained. Next slide, please. Prices. Well, one consequence is that if we have that additional capacity in the ROC process, and now we didn't have it, potentially with the ROC adjustment, we would have more committed capacity in the real time, and naturally the price may tend to get lower because now we have capacity that was not priced in the integrated forward market. If we didn't have that capacity committed, we didn't have the ROC adjustments, potentially we can see that there is less capacity sitting at PMIN in the real-time market, and therefore the prices naturally would tend to go higher. Did we see a better convergence of the markets from the day ahead to the real time? I would say one day, 1 point doesn't make a trend. It's inconclusive to say whether it was a material difference on prices. Again, the real-time pricing is quite dynamic based on all the conditions of the real time, so we have to be cautious to draw conclusions prematurely. But what we can see all in all is that the delta and the divergence or convergence between day ahead and real time seems to be not worse than what we saw for adjacent days. Next slide, please. One could ask, well, how typical is the day that we pick off April 11th to be able to rationalize the overall dynamics of the ROC adjustments across the board? How good is April 11th to draw conclusions for September 7th or for November 10th? Well, we expanded this and we covered actually 3 different time frames. We covered the extreme weather conditions of September 4th to 10th, but also shoulder months where we may have naturally more uncertainty, more variability. And these are the shoulder months coming into the winter and going into the spring, November and March. And we wanted to see how much capacity we gain materially by having the ROC adjustments, how much the real time gets deprived of having that capacity needed to be positioned properly for the real time. Let me go quickly into these 3 buckets of data. Let's move to the next slide, please. This is the first period, and these are the very famous heat wave days of September 4th through the 10th. And here you have the composition. When we apply the conformance, remember we have conformance in the range of 5,000, 7,000, 9,000 megawatts. How the ROC process was able to meet that additional ROC adjustment by that much. It could either commit additional units, it can bring in additional interties, it can reduce exports, or indeed it can be infeasible. There is simply nothing else available to be able to meet that additional load obligation. And the color codes that you have here try to estimate that contributions from the different ways to meet that additional ROC adjustment. And you can see, for instance, infeasibility, the first bucket in red, is quite prevalent in the peak hours of the day, effectively meaning for these days of the extreme weather, high load, even though we put a conformance of, let's say, 7,500 megawatts for September 5th, for that critical hour ending 18th, nothing was committed or procured simply because there was nothing else available. The full ROC adjustment was fully infeasible, so it didn't drive any additional commitments or dispatches because there was nothing left available. In other days, for instance, if you pick September 9th, the second last from right to left in the lower row, you can see that it's a nice combination of different ways. Out of the over 9,000 megawatts of ROC adjustments, the majority was infeasible, meaning we didn't have enough capacity to be able to meet that additional load obligation. There was some portion of incremental dispatches, very tiny incremental dispatches. There were some export cuts, reductions, that are the ones in blue. And there were indeed some ROC binding. The market was still able to find some capacity that could be committed. But just keep in mind, I'm picking that day, that is already September 9. This is the time when we actually start moving into an over forecasting condition and we start to regain that capacity. We have passed the most critical days where there was no capacity left available. Next slide, please. Let's change the time frame. Now we move into November. That typically is the time of the day where we are coming into the cold season and conditions start to change. When we apply the ROC adjustment, what do we gain in the ROC process? The color code is the same, and you can see that only in one day we have that ROC adjustment met largely by infeasibilities. And this is interesting. If you see infeasibilities in our ending 10 through 16, that is for November 13, the lower left corner, that doesn't mean that we met the ROC adjustment by just being infeasible. Indeed, we minimized the infeasibility because it happens to be an oversupply infeasibility. We have oversupply conditions, and by having this rock adjustment, we just simply mute that oversupply. Then in the other days, the dominant trend is incremental dispatches. That means, yes, we have capacity. It's a matter of just incrementally dispatch them. They are already committed. Or we can have some startups, and the majority of those were short start. So let's move to the next bucket. That is the other side of the coin. That is when we are coming into the spring, summertime. And this is March 2023. What you have here is the same combination, the same structure of the breakdown. What do we gain by having the rock adjustments? In some cases, middle of the day, we minimize oversupply, or we mute oversupply because this is the middle of the day. And in some cases, we have short start units. These are not material gains of capacity because they can be committed in the real time. And the majority, like for the first day of March 15, the upper corner on the left, the majority of the rock adjustment would have been met simply by marginally dispatching resources that are already online. So these three sets of dates give you a more general context of what the rock adjustment is providing towards the real time. And obviously conditions matter. The conclusions that you may drive from day to day may be slightly different given the conditions specific to that day. But one thing remains kind of valid across the board, and that is every time we apply the rock adjustment, it doesn't mean we gain materially the same amount of additional committed capacity, because the market is going to find any way to meet that capacity by different means. Only a fraction for the best cases, and nothing in some other cases, of additional capacity is gained towards the real time. I think that's what I have for this first topic. Can we move to the next slide just to ensure that I don't have any left over? Yeah, just to conclude on this item. We are not done. We are just at the beginning of this assessment that we are doing internal to our processes, the functionality of the market. We still have to put the piece together of how this is interplaying with the functionality that we implemented for the flexible ramping product. And we will continue to report as things happen. Now that we have moved to loads of 35,000 megawatts, as you may have seen, we have some type of pickup load because of the weather conditions getting warm. That is typically expected for this time of the year. We are moving beyond the threshold of 35,000 megawatts. There will be some conformance that we will see for the rock process, and now we're going to start assessing effectively how good that is to redefine if that is the right threshold or we need to do anything else. So this is still a work in progress. It's still a moving target because we're trying to assess holistically where we are, and one way to do it is to go into the real system and try to judiciously set up conditions that allow us in real life to test the premises of what we need to do to improve the performance by minimizing the conformances that we have been applying for several years in the market. Let me pause before I jump to the next topic and see if we can have questions. I see already one hand raised by Daniel. Brenda?
Your line is unmuted. Go ahead.
Department of Water Resources. I have a question about if it's any relationship between the ROC deployment and RTCIO, real-time congestion imbalance offset. And if you guys, the second question, if you guys, this workshop is going to talk about the real-time congestion imbalance offset.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't catch the context of the second comment, the question of the workshop. Can you elaborate more on that?
Well, we've seen increases in real-time congestion imbalance offset 60% in 2022 from 2021, and the first 5 months of 2023, another 60% from the average of 2022. I mean, for the entire 2022, if we prorate 5 months in 2023, the increase is again 60%. And I know ISO has a white paper that's probably done for 9 months on the RTCIO, and maybe to explain the increases, but it's probably on the works on the legal, and it didn't come up. So I was wondering, this RTCIO, if this workshop is going to talk about the RTCIO, is going to report on it, or if not, and if not, if there is any could be the ROC deployment somehow tied to the increases in RTCIO that we observed in the past years.
Okay, yeah, I got it. Just to be clear, when you refer to workshop, you are meaning this morning discussion that is the market performance forum.
Yes,
you
yes,
are not referring
yes,
to something else.
Sorry.
Okay, okay, thank you for the clarification. Yes, I think that is an interesting point, because there could be dynamics that are happening between the load conformance apply versus the real-time congestion or energy offset. And yes, that it's an area that we have to fully assess of how the load conformance is impacting that side of the equation. I don't have a specific material to try to connect these dots in this session today, but I can guarantee you that that would be a topic that we will continue to discuss I don't need the next, but eventually as part of this effort of assessing the load conformance, because obviously the settlements implications is part of the overall picture here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Do we have any questions on the phone, operator?
There are currently no questions in queue on the phone only line.
Okay. Let's move on to the next topic. And this is a quick update regarding a new practice that we have. For those of you that have been actively participating in the policy efforts, there was an effort that we completed, I believe, in late December 2022 regarding the resource efficiency evaluation enhancements phase 2. And that was actually FERC approved just in late May this year, and we are ready to go live with some of the components, and that is what we call the track 2. And one of these components is a program that we have called Assistant Energy Transfer. It is an effort discussed through a formal policy stakeholder process, and this process is effectively providing an ability for those participating in the Western energy imbalance market to gain some reliability benefits when there is a potential deficiency in the capacity or flexibility assessed through the test. Under the current logic, when a balancing area failed the test, flex or capacity, the consequence is that they are going to be locked, capped by the amount of transfers they can rely in the real-time market. They cannot bring more than the base schedules or the last clearing transfers, and that is the consequence that has been in place for failing the test. This program is trying to create an exception for those that are opting in to participate in the program. They can still rely on additional transfers if the capacity is there, as long as they have opted in. And there are some settlement implications because now there is a specific logic to settle that transfer. But in the end, it's a matter of ensuring that if there is capacity, why not to rely on that capacity to handle the tightness of that area that potentially failed the test. Now, process-wise, first, this becomes effective July 1st. Part of the process is that the notification to opt in has to take in advance at least 5 business days. And that means if this becomes effective in July 1st, the first determination for July 1st has to happen around June 23rd, effectively 1 week in advance. And there are some other logic pieces that make these things more complicated because you have to take into account holidays, weekends. So this is based on at least 5 business days. And the designation is to opt in or opt out, and it has to have an effective start and end date. Similar to any balancing area, the CAISO may be able to participate in that program. And in order to participate, it has to come with the decision to opt in or not. As part of the discussion that has happened over the last few months about how to define the rules for this program, the current state of affairs for the process is that the CAISO area specifically is going to be making an assessment to opt in or not on a daily basis and comply with the same time frame of 5 business days. Next slide, please. And that trigger for specifically for the CAISO balancing area is based on a quick assessment of the supply condition for that date that is effective 7 days in advance. And the logic is quite simple, and it follows very much the graphical representation that we have of the array condition that you can see in the Outlook. We have this trend of the next 7, 8 days, and based on that, we can see whether we have enough supply to be able to meet the load obligation. Load obligation means the load forecast plus the AES obligation, and in this case, because we're projecting to have a condition 8 days in advance, there may be some uncertainty, right? So we have this buffer of 5% other. And we do that based on the gross load forecast, but also on the net load forecast. And if that condition is triggering, effectively the CAISO is going to be opting in for that specific date. So for July 1st, we did that determination on June 23rd, and we didn't opt in. There was no condition for that. And the subsequent days, because there was a weekend in between, have to be called based on June 23rd. So July 1, 2, and 3 were opt-out based on the determination of June 23rd. And in the recent days, we have continued to run that. It's a program that we run every day just to make the determination. So far, for the first 5 days, that is the time when we put this slide together, the CAISO has been running this, and in all these 5 days, we have not opted in. When we are going to opt in, there will be a market message posted so that people, participants, know that the CAISO is opting in. Different balancing areas, they have their criteria to decide to opt in or not. They just have to run through the same time frame of 5 business days notification so that we can really put that information into our systems and making it effective for that trading date. That's all what I have for this topic. Let me see if there are any questions.
Guillermo, I don't see any questions in queue. Michelle, any questions in the audio?
No, there are currently no questions.
Okay, let's move back to the next topic. Actually, yeah, this is the one topic of one market issue that we have. I will hand it to Amber. Amber, are you there?
Everyone. All right, I wanted to bring one topic on a market issue that happened a little bit ago to the Market Performance Planning Forum for awareness of what occurred, why it occurred, as well as the next steps to make sure that we don't see it happen again. Next slide. As many are aware, this is an EIM-specific issue. On 5/23, we had stale and missing EIM VER forecasts in the market from about 2:54 p.m. until 5:06 a.m. in the morning. Overall, we, as many do server fallbacks from our primary to backup center to test out redundancy in the system. During that switch to test the redundancy, the EIM VER forecasts were not updating, but the update did not activate as expected upon the completion of that task. So the overall impact is there were EIM VER forecasts that did not have published updates for around 14 hours. The biggest impact is to those that are not on the persistent method. If you were on the persistent method, your RTD forecast would be updating because that was outside of the place where the issue occurred. But your RTPD forecast would have been stale or potentially ran out of forecast depending on how long each EIM entity submits their rolling forecast to the ISO. So with that, there is an alert that is finalized and set up specific to alert the CAISO teams immediately when the EIM VER forecasts are not published. This was a defect that we found following the switch. And then also we do know and understand that this does impact the FRP requirements because of the difference between the RTPD and the RTD forecast for those that are on the persistence forecast. So we have marked the day of 523 and 524 as bad data to ensure that the FRP requirements are not impacted from this error. And with that, I will pause and see if there are any questions.
Hi, Amber. I don't see any questions in queue. Michelle, do we have any audio or any questions?
No, there are currently no questions in queue.
All right. Well, with that, I will move on to the next slide and the next topic, which is the FRP update, and pass it back.
Thank you, Amber. Okay, this is going to be a very interesting topic to discuss. There are many areas of the FRP that we can cover. There is a lot of material posted in this presentation. I will try to glance through some of those and move quickly because there is a lot of material to cover. And just as a refresher, we have implemented the enhancements for FRP back to November 2023. That was after a long implementation time to have this nodal approach. As you may recall, one of the main issues that we faced after implementing the original version of the flexible ramping product was the realization that there were challenges to be able to deploy that capacity procured through the FRP because of congestion. So the market was optimizing so well that was allocating the procurement on resources that were held back because of congestion, and it was able to find that precisely that room available for FRP was created because of congestion. So when the need came to deploy that capacity into energy, it couldn't flow because congestion was preventing to move that resource up. After a long policy effort and implementation, we have implemented this effectively in February, and there are some conditions we have identified. Some of those have been discussed in the previous MPPF. Some of those may be new to you. I will try to go through this as fast as I can. The first one has to do, there are two main pieces. The first one is we redesign the logical calculation for estimating the FRP requirements. Based on uncertainty, we used to have a histogram approach. Now we use a regression approach that is more sophisticated because it takes into account as fits the load forecast, the wind and solar forecast. That was one of the items that was the genesis to move forward with this modification, to gain that ability to rely on the determination of the requirements using the current forecast. And the second part has to do with all the logic in the market to make it nodal and how to ensure that the capacity is deliverable, and having all these deployment scenarios, generating nodal prices. And these are kind of two big interrelated components that were implemented at the same time. The first part of this topic is regarding the requirements per se. How are we seeing the requirements to evolve? What are the trends of those? And naturally, we would expect that the requirements are going to be calculated more efficiently, more accurately. That doesn't mean necessarily that the requirements have to be lower or higher than before. the aim here is to make it more accurate. Here you have some comparisons over the recent months. And we try to keep for these comparisons at least the last 2 months prior to the implementation. We have February to be the time when we have this new feature. The 2 months before is the old fashion. And it's a good reference to have as a comparison. Now, keep in mind that we are in the period of seasons, and therefore it's not just a matter of comparing December versus May, because now we're talking about quite different conditions, seasonal conditions, weather-based conditions that we have to keep in mind. Still, trending-wise is a reference that could be useful. And here you have the first, that is the trending of the FRP upward requirements. And this is a very standard plot that you are going to see for many metrics that we put together. It's a box whisker plot. The box captures the 50% distribution of the sample. The whiskers are going to capture basically 1.5 interquantile of the samples. Anytime you see dots in the ends of the whiskers, that stands for outliers. And this is just a very simple way to see the distribution of the data sample. In this case, you have, for instance, one box for every month capturing all the requirements that applies for that corresponding month and just organizing and estimating the quantiles. The horizontal line that is inside the box stands for the 50 percentile, the middle point. And that gives you a sense, relatively speaking, where the requirements are going to be most of the time. And if you just take as a simple reference the midpoint, that is the horizontal line, and you compare across, you can see where the 50 percentile sits. And we can see that for the upward requirement, there is no very explicit change in pattern. We can see they are up and down depending on the month, depending on the season, and on the weather conditions. So we cannot draw a conclusion that now the FRP requirements are completely different because of the implementation of the logic. We can argue that, well, after February, we can see that the values are higher, yes, because part of the logic was to redefine the caps that we have. And in this case, you can see that we are reaching up to 2,500 megawatts. In some cases, like April, we didn't go that far. Next slide, please. This is the same requirement in the upward direction for the CAISO area over the period of time. The previous one was just on a monthly basis, just to see the bigger picture. Here you can see all the variation on a daily basis, and you can see obviously it's pretty crowded plot, but gives you a sense how the distribution is moving along over a longer period of time. And you can see that there is no specific trend. They tend to be slightly higher with implementation in February. That is somehow not surprising, but it seems to be still within a reasonable range with respect to the previous 2 months. Next slide, please. And this is the hourly profile. Time of the day matters, right? Not every interval is created the same. And we can see that there is a very good, I would say, something that you can appreciate in this plot on an hourly profile is that it seems to be a better pattern, better definition of the profile once we have implemented the BARC and the quantile regression approach, where you have effectively 2 peaks, morning and evening peak. You have the valley in the middle of the day, and you can see how high the requirements are depending on the time of the day. And given the time of the year, it's not surprising that sometimes the peak in the morning is going to be actually higher than the peak prior to the peak of the night. And that just gives you a sense of how the requirements are evolving through the day, but also through the month of the different weather conditions. Next slide, please. And this is the same information for the downward. Now, the downward seems to be a more significant change. You can see that it significantly increased starting from February. And in the past, at least in December, January, the maximum were no greater than 1,300 megawatts or so. starting in February, the maximum values have been over 1,1800 megawatts. And that is one of the consequences of having this more precise calculation trying to capture the conditions. Next slide, please. Same information on a day-by-day basis, just to give you a better granularity how they are evolving over time. Next slide, please. Now, there are many facets we can explore about the functioning of this new feature and this new calculation. We're going to cover a few of them. One natural consequence of the change that we implemented in February has to do potentially with how variable, how volatile the requirements on their own are going to be. Prior to the logic change, the requirements were calculated in some fashion static, because they were the same for the full hour and they were defined in advance. They were not subject to the changing forecast conditions of the moment. So you would expect that the previous requirements were somehow static because the framework was built in that fashion. Once we move into using the load forecast, the wind and solar forecast as the input to the requirements for that point on time, naturally you expect to see some more variability. And now we move from one single value for the hour to specific values of interval by interval on 15-minute basis. So that alone structurally is going to give you more variability, because now you have changes every 15 minutes based on load forecast, wind, solar forecast conditions that were not present in the past. And this is a sample of specific areas. These are not aggregated by region. These are specific areas that are part of the Southwest. It will be one of these areas, either SRP, Arizona, or Nevada. I just picked one to reflect the Southwest area. The CAISO is the entire balancing area of the CAISO. We have another one in the Northwest and another one in the Mountain West, just to have a sense of the regionally speaking nature of the requirements. And it's a mixed bag. You can see in some cases the new logic starting with February 2023 that is represented with bars in gray tend to be, for instance, higher volatility. This is measured by standard deviation. This is one standard deviation with respect to the previous year, right? And that is reflected by having the gray bars higher than the bars in blue, and we are trying to compare the same months of the year. In some cases, for the CAISO, for instance, it's still higher than the previous year, but not that much. If you have other areas like in the Northwest or Mountain West, it's in some cases higher, in some cases lower, or even about the same. I would say 4-5 months, and so far June is partial month. Is starting to see a trend. We will see how that evolves towards the dip of the summer and have a longer period to be able to draw conclusions on the trend. But again, structurally speaking, the way the new calculation is defined and the elements of that naturally is going to open the door for having more variability of these requirements, because they change 15 minutes to 15 minutes based precisely on the forecast elements that we have now to be inputs. Next slide. This is another way to see the variability of the FRP requirements. The previous one was a very classical statistical measure of a standard deviation. Here is not a standard deviation. This is slightly different, and I call this jumpiness, because it's to measure the difference, the delta between adjacent intervals. When we go from interval 1 requirement to interval 3 requirement, how much movement, how much delta we have. That is what this metric is measuring. So I didn't even post information prior to the implementation of February 2022, because it's going to be relatively, sorry, my bad. I'm confused here with the metrics. This is a metric of jumpiness, just the delta between adjacent intervals. And we do show here the trends going back all the way to January 2022 to compare how the last 5 months after implementing the FRP feature is looking like. And what you see here is that, yes, there is a change, and you can see that very clearly when you zoom in. That is the main plot here. How the distribution has changed starting with February 2023. You can see that now you have a nice distribution in the smaller range of changes. The y-axis is megawatts, and the boxes are capturing the 50% of the sample. You can see that now they are more concentrated in that box. That means we have more samples around the zero relative to the outliers. Next slide, please. This is for the upward direction. And this is for the downward direction. And you can see the trend exactly the same, right? How we are coming with this type of envelope that is opening up as we progress through the summer months. So, and the upper small picture is just the full size of the distribution. Here I just make a zoom into the first 100 megawatts in either direction. And yes, we do have differences, movements that are either positive or negative. We did have, but we didn't post here the hourly profile. That is also a very interesting profile. So you can see there is something that has changed starting in February 2023 that now that jumpiness, that net movement has, in a distribution way, changed in a very meaningful fashion. Let me go to the next slide to try to unpack this a little bit more. And this is a better way to visualize the distributions of the jumpiness. This is the variability of the requirement. Here you have an explicit distribution plot for the same period, starting in January 2022 all the way through June 2027. And June, again, is a partial month. What you have here is all the deltas between adjacent intervals distributed in whatever fashion belongs to. And you can see that for all the months prior to the implementation of the FRP, we have this very nice, almost normal distribution around the zero with some nice symmetrical tails. And you can see that all the deltas are nicely compacted around the zero. That means we have a small deltas between adjacent intervals. This graph is kind of deceiving because if you zoom in a little bit more, you can see that there are indeed tails, but just the resolution is not that great because of the specific frame I'm showing. But when you go into the months of February and onward, you can see that the height of that distribution is much smaller. We have effectively less deltas around zero. We basically elongated the distribution. There are less deltas around zero, and there are more deltas along the spectrum that are non-zero. So we have elongated the distribution. That means we have more non-zero and larger deltas after we have implemented FRP. And that's expected because, again, when you compare, for instance, the deltas of interval 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and 3 to 4 before February, it's going to be zero because it was one single requirement for the full hour. So there will be basically only deltas that are non-zero when you move between hours. That means when you go from interval 4 of the current hour to interval 1 of the next hour. That is only when you are going to see a delta. But any delta that is intra-hour is going to be effectively zero. And that is the reason you have so many points collected around the 0 point prior to February 2023. And that's different once we implemented the logic because now you may have deltas that are non-zero among any adjacent intervals, not just on the boundary of the hours. And that is the reason you see this type of distributions. This is for the upward direction. Next slide, please, is going to show the one for the downward direction. it looks kind of the same, and it's the same rationale. And how the distributions look that different now is precisely because of the construct that we have, moving from hourly to 15-minute basis, and now the 15 is also influenced by the forecast changes that are happening every 15 minutes. Next slide. This is another way to try to get a better feeling of the changes that are happening with the FRP. And we have 3 passes in the resource efficiency evaluation. The FRP requirements are used for both the test, to assess the flexibility test, but also in the real-time market. But the first part is how the FRP requirements are defined and how they are going to set up the balancing area to position resources accordingly to be able to pass the test. So it's critical for the entities participating in the Western energy imbalance market to have a foreseeable certain reference of what the value should be. So we have 3 passes that are the T75, followed by T55, and then followed by the last one that is T40. The distributions that you see here are capturing the deltas, how much the requirement is changing from the first pass, 75, to the second pass, 55. And positive, negative depends on the condition. In this case, a positive value means that the T55 requirement came higher than the requirement coming originally at T75. It has been an increase of the requirement. We also can do the same, moving from the second pass into the third pass. Well, in this case, the deltas are going to be 0. They are not even shown here because we know they are going to be 0, because effectively it's the same requirement we use from T55 to T40, because as per some previous discussions and efforts that we implemented a few years ago, we wanted to lock in the changes going from the second to the third reference so that participants could have a very certain reference point to the test, so that we don't have a moving target from pass to pass. And that is the reason there are no deltas. There is no variation of the requirements going from the second pass to the third pass. And when you see the distribution of these samples, and this is specific for the CAISO area, you can see that somehow it's around the 0. The changes may happen in either upward or downward direction. That means the T55 or 40, in some cases, are going to be using higher requirements, in some cases, lower requirements, where it depends on the specific conditions, but you have, relatively speaking, a nice and kind of symmetrical distribution of the deltas between the different passes. Let's move to the next slide to see if we are changing reference. Okay, this is the downward direction. I think we have covered this. Next slide, please. Okay, before we change slightly the focus of the presentation, we're still in the FRP space, but it's going to take a different turn now. So let's see if we have any questions on the phone or on the chat. Brenda, Michelle?
Yes, so we do have a question from Robert. Robert, you'll be unmuted. Please be sure to state your name and affiliation.
This is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. Could you go back to slide 48, please? Yeah, well, thank you very much for the slide. It's a very good piece of information. I wanted to ask a question. You stated that this variability is really due to the changes between the intervals of the 15-minute forecast requirement. I would be curious what your answer would be in regards to, is it possible that this could also be the changes of the forecast between days? Due to the way the natural variability of the mosaic calculation, where calculation changes are calculated hourly, as well as the forecast deviations that are occurring with the mosaic calculations. Because to me, this also includes deviations between days, not necessarily between intervals. And I don't know if I could necessarily break this graph down to the variations between intervals or days.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I think I get your question, Robert, and that is very nuanced question. And you are right, there are many moving pieces, right? I think I pointed to one that is structurally meaningful that we know is going to be there from the get-go. Now, to your point, there may be other levels of implications and more subtle dynamics like the one you are pointing that, well, we are now doing the FRP requirements based on forecast conditions for today, but the way we construct the mosaic is relying on data from the last 180 days, right? Well, if we are now in May, potentially we may be using data that was related to forecasting weather conditions all the way back to March, February, even some days of January as of now. So yes, that is one item that is a little bit sensitive to tune, I would say, because there are two sides of the equation. One is, and all this is about the data sample that you need to rely on to build your regression model, right? Your regression model is going to be as good as your sample data is. And in the past, the forecasting team was able to point to this specific issue because it could potentially be a matter of discussion what is best. And we indeed did some assessment of whether one way of sampling the data is better than the others. And here is the challenge. Right now, we have the 180-day sampling method. That means where you are, you go back all 180 days to build the coefficients of the regression. And again, as if you try to go even farther back, you start getting into trouble because now you are capturing conditions that are somehow not very well related to the prevailing conditions. Right now we are entering summer and you are going to be relying on historical data that belongs to winter, right? So it doesn't seem to be a very strong way to derive that coefficient. And that is one of the reasons the forecasting team some time ago explored the condition well. Instead of just using the last 180 days, can we use type of mix of, maybe we can use similar conditions of 1 year ago? There is no precise answer. I can say that yes, it's going to influence what sample you use because it's going to be an element in the determination of the coefficients and therefore in the value of the requirements. I would say that it's going to be difficult to strike the perfect solution given these limitations. If you take a sample that is too short, now you may not have a very robust data sample to derive the requirements. If you go too far, you start eating into a weather season that is not very reflective of the current. If you go back to 1 year ago for the same period, your profile of the resources may have changed. So it's always a trade-off discussion of what could be better. And I will let the forecasting team to expand that more. I don't know if that answers somehow your question. To your point, yes, there could be other factors that impact this.
Yeah, I think that's very useful here. I think a component that might also be important to take a measurement is really the bell curve aspect of the mosaic and how the forecast changes between those time frames. So one of the bell curves, if you have a high forecast value, it could be a low requirement, but then the next day you have variability in your wind, or renewables, excuse me, and that results in a higher requirement. Understanding that change would be very useful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, before passing it to the forecasting team, do we have any other questions? And I think this is a natural transition for them to pick up on this discussion. Brenda, Michelle?
No questions at this time.
Okay, let me hand it over to them. I don't know if they want to start this with further discussion on this sampling. Hong, Amber.
Thank you, and good questions, Robert. I think one of the things that I'll touch base on, and Guillermo alluded to it, is in the RSEE Phase 2 initiative, we did put a lot of metrics out in relation to the FRP histogram versus the mosaic. One of the things that the forecasting team is monitoring very closely is the historical data sample that's being utilized, right? In the past, right now, it is implemented at 180 days of historical data. We saw benefits and presented benefits on what we call sample scheme 3, which is a combination of looking at 90 days in the past, but also 90 days of similar weather situation from year previous. There's pros and cons to that, right? It may assist heavily the forecast mechanism or assist the forecast mechanism in having some more clarity of the pattern change that's happening, especially as we transition from spring to summer and then summer into the rainy season. But it is a large computational task to add that much data in. And I know Guillermo will touch on some of that computational pieces a little bit later, but it's something that we are watching very closely as it relates. But as the requirement is moving, I mean, I think that was very expected with the new methodology that went in due to the fact that, you know, ultimately we calculated it daily and we had some variances between weekday and weekend in the previous calculation, but right now, you know, we're calculating coefficients daily, but we're also calculating the updates every forecast change that comes in. So those forecast differences and those forecast changes do have more of an impact to get you the right requirement at the right time. So with that, let me transition into some of the metrics that we're calculating at this time for the FRP requirements. If you could go forward, there we go. So we put two areas on here, CAISO and both the WEIM area, to show some comparisons. These are the metrics we've talked about before. I didn't define them in this slide, but I will talk to them on a high level for a refresher. So there's 4 metrics that the forecasting team is really monitoring as it relates to the forecasting of the FRP requirements. This is a more probabilistic forecast, so it's not as, you know, forecast minus actual based, right? So one of those metrics is coverage. And really the coverage metric is used to check the validity of that model. Are we seeing that if we're headed towards the 95th percentile and we want 97.5 on the top and 2.5 on the bottom, are we within that range, the percent of time that we're expecting, which at this point in time is targeted for 95th percentile. So you see that it varies with month on coverage right now. We are seeing some of the months where you have higher coverage. February, for instance, had a higher coverage, really got you to that 95th percentile for CAISO, slightly underneath that 95th percentile for the WEIM area. When we got into the more renewable volatility seasons of March and April, you did see that the coverage during that period of time was a little bit less than the 95th percentile due to the amount of movement that we were seeing on the renewable side of the house for both the CAISO footprint as well as the WEIM area. But ultimately, coverage remains about the same as what we had previously reported in the last MPPF. It is slightly under what the histogram would have provided, and it's something that we're monitoring going forward because the goal is to get to that 95th% coverage for the FRP requirements. Next slide. So of course, we're monitoring the requirement itself. I know Guillermo presented many graphs on different pieces of that requirement. These are really a high level look at the average requirements that have happened by month for the CAISO and the EIM area. So you see that the average up requirement really sitting around that 1,000 megawatts for the CAISO, a little bit higher than that for the WEIM area as a whole, about 1,200 megawatts on the upside, and then CAISO is about 800 megawatts on the downside, and about a little over 1,000 megawatts on the downside for the WEIM area right now. There's a little bit more consistency in the requirements as we went through the different months. But those are there. We are seeing an average, the trend still holds the same. The average estimated requirement of the mosaic is less than the histogram on average. There are periods of time, of course, that the mosaic is providing more requirements to help with some of the volatility in the forecasts that are occurring. Next slide. Exceedance. So one of the things we also want to watch is you're looking at the observed uncertainty that ended up happening on the system, and you want to look at the average megawatt difference between that observed or realized uncertainty in addition to the estimated requirement, with the goal of being and taking that forecast information in, being closer to the observed uncertainty or realized uncertainty that is occurring. We are seeing good benefits in the mosaic methodology as it relates to exceedance, where you know, we're exceeding about, and on max, about 160 megawatts. But you do see April coming down on the CAISO side overall. So you're pretty close, if we are exceeding, to where that realized uncertainty is in comparison to the requirements that we saw on the previous slide, which were around 1,000 megawatts. The WEIM area, the exceedance is a little bit higher because of the bigger footprint that exists there. It's around a little shy of 300 megawatts on the upside, and the downside, it has a little bit more variability on both the CAISO and the WEIM area. But ultimately, we are seeing that this is one of the larger areas of benefit of the Mosaic, is that when we do exceed the observed requirement, the Mosaic is doing a better job not exceeding it as much. So these are the metrics that we are watching for the overall FRP performance, along with the requirements. It is still fairly new in production, and we'll continue to report out on some of the observations we're seeing, as well as, you know, if there's other metrics that we need to monitor when you're looking at more of a probabilistic forecast accuracy set versus, you know, the deterministic forecast minus actual divided by actual or divided by capacity, like you show when we talk about load and renewables. Next slide. All right, with that, I will pause to see if there are any questions on requirements. I know we're really going to wrap up the requirement section. We're going to go a little bit more into the market side of it. Do we have any questions on requirements?
Amber, I don't see any
Currently,
questions.
no questions.
I think I heard no questions across the board. All right, that must mean you guys are really excited about the requirement performance. That's what I'm hoping. All right, then I'm going to pass it back to Guillermo.
Guillermo, you're muted.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, let's move now into a different aspect of the FRP, and that has to do with the implications of the resource efficiency evaluation. This is a tracking of the frequency for each balancing area regarding the passing or failures of the flexible ramping test. The flexible ramping requirement with the new calculation are utilized to determine the requirements to pass or fail the FRP, the flexible ramping test. And this is a percentage representation of how frequently the different balancing areas have been failing the test. And we, again, include a couple of months prior to February just to have a reference of the trend. And there may seem to be an increasing volume of failures. You can see that as we move from the left to the right, the plot becomes more blue. And that is a representation of higher levels. But it could also be a matter that we are moving into out of the spring season, and therefore the conditions are naturally changing. So that is the reason it's always complicated to draw conclusions in a very short window of time. Keep that as a reference. Next slide, please. And this is also for the downward. And we have the RSE applied to the upward and downward direction. And the trend seems to be kind of in the same direction. There seems to be a slight increase over time. Next slide, please. And this one, oops, I think can you step back one, please? This is the same information, but organized by time of the day. And this is specific to May, the more recent month that we have. And the meaningful of this information is to identify where in the day the failures typically tend to happen. And not surprisingly, for the flexible ramping upward test, that is largely concentrated around the peak hours. If we move to the next slide, that is for the downward direction, you can see that that happens to be in the morning time frame, typically around the morning peak of the day. Next slide, please. Now, when we implemented FRP, there was a whole redesign of the market features. And one of those has to do with the concept that now, when we are enforcing the FRP requirements in the market, after we have passed the test, we have this concept of grouping together all the balancing areas that pass the test. And we keep still independent and separate those that failed the test. We have right now up to 23 balancing areas now that we have on board the El Paso, Guapa, and Avangrid. And out of these 23 different balancing areas, some may fail, some may pass at any point on time because the test is also assessed on 15-minute basis. And when you come into the market, we are going to be enforcing one single requirement that is defined, that is constructed and estimated only for the group of balancing areas that pass the test as one single group together. And we still enforce the requirements for each individual area that failed the test. The beauty of this diversity is that once you have all these passing areas grouped into one single wider footprint, that is the area, that is the requirement that is going to be enforced to be procured in the real-time market. And because now we have the enforcement of the transfers, the schedule, the transmission constraints, we ensure that even though we have a wider footprint, they are still going to be feasible to flow if the deployment needs to happen. Here is just a very basic reference of how frequently we have the composition of the passing group by the different balancing areas. It's not the same balancing area. Today, we may have one failure of balancing area A. 1 hour later, it could be balancing area B, and it still is one area that failed. So it's not the explicit permutation, but just the count-wise permutations of how many balancing areas make up the passing group at any given day. And what you can see here is that, in general, we have few failures for the different balancing areas, and therefore, the dominant grouping that we have to enforce in the real-time market is when all the entities are part of the passing group, and that is over 80%. We may have started in mid-February with a higher percentage for other balancing areas. That means less than 80% for all the passing groups. But as we move towards May, we can see that it's even close to 100% in some days. And that is an indication of just how frequently different balancing areas fail to not be able to be part of this diverse grouping construct to leverage on the flexibility among a wider footprint. Next slide, please. And next slide. Now let me move into a different area, and I will glance through this because there are too many of these. Now that we move from the test, from the requirement to the test to enforcing the constraint in the market, now we cover the area of how the market procure for the capacity. And there are, again, different facets how you can cover this procurement. The first one is how the procurement profile has changed for FRP once we have implemented the new model. These two plots go into the daily profile and the hourly profile per month, and it's organized by the different balancing areas. The fact that you see that many colors and that many groups is a good indication that the procurement of the FRP is quite diverse across the wide footprint. You are getting procurement from basically all the areas. And depending on the conditions, the procurement may change. But the point to highlight here is that, yes, the procurement is from a diverse source of capacity. Next slide, please. This is the same procurement, but organized now by the type of technology. What type of resources are supporting the procurement of FRP? Again, organized over a period of time or by hourly profile per month. And each color indicates one type of technology. The orange on the top is gas resources, all the way through storage resources, solar, water, wind. And you can see that it's a good mix. There is no dominant technology capturing the procurement of FRP consistently. Indeed, if you go a little bit more into the details of the upper left plot, you can see that prior to the implementation, a meaningful portion of the FRP was procured indeed from storage resources. And once we implemented that in February, that got more diverse. And you see that green section reduced after February. Next slide, please. This one is the same information for regulation down or for capacity down. And I will just skip those. It's the same information, the same construct. Keep moving, please. 2 more slides forward. And here is an interesting one. This is the procurement that is pointing to a reference point on time specific to the CAISO. And you can see that there is a quite meaningful change of pattern starting in February. And you can see that effectively all the procurement from CAISO was significantly reduced with the new logic. And that has 2 reasons. First, now, with the implementation of the new logic, we no longer enforced what we used to have for the CAISO that was a minimum requirement. That was part of an older effort that we implemented to ensure that there was a floor of a minimum capacity coming from the CAISO area, given the size of the CAISO area relative to the rest of the areas. With that no longer in place, the economics of the wider footprint is really what plays a role here, and naturally CAISO gets less procurement from its internal resources because most of the time it's part of a wider footprint, and therefore the capacity may effectively come from any other area that is in that grouping passing area. Next slide, please. And this is the same, but just organized by technology. And next slide, please. Next slide. One more. One more. One more. Prices. Let me change. Before I change to prices, let me see if there are any questions regarding this composition of the procurement. Brenda, Michelle?
Yeah, Robert, let's go ahead and take your question.
Hello, Guillermo. This is Robert Fisher with NV Energy. Can you go back to slide 61 just real quick? I have a quick ask in regards to this piece of information that you This is done by area. With the introduction of the nodal FRP, we no longer have the ability to see the aggregation awards based upon area. And so these slides are really important for the understanding. While I think this graph is very interesting looking and very colorful, I was curious if we could get another level of granularity in regards to this information because we can't do that in analytics ourselves anymore. Could it be possible to have this broken down by region and then from the region individual areas? Because it's very tricky for me to see PG&E difference to P&M difference to PAC-S difference. So variations of those blues are very close, and it's quite difficult. And as I mentioned, I don't have that data available to do its own analytics anymore for myself, so we're dependent upon these individual slides.
Yeah, I get it. I understand. That is the downside of having that many participants in the market, that you run out of colors very quickly.
I totally agree.
Just to understand your question, to make sure that we don't miss the mark here, when you refer to regions, you're talking about Northwest, Mountain West, Southwest, Desert West, or some other type of definition?
I'm fine with that, just some more granularity in regards to being able to see these procurement levels.
Sure, I think that's reasonable. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, prices. One of the concerns that originally was introduced with the assessment of the FRP was that most of the time, over 90 or 90+% of the time, prices of FRP were basically zero. And that's a price signal that is telling us how valuable, how meaningful that FRP capacity is. And there are different dynamics. We implemented different enhancements over the years to try to ensure that the construct was as accurate as possible to send the right signals. Now that we have the FRP, one expectation is that the prices are going to be potentially even nodal once we have congestion kicking in and creating these price separations. This is a very crude way to see the prices. It's just kind of a frequency way. We do see some prices non-zero. That is good news. But if you compare the first 2 months versus the subsequent months, you don't see a dramatic difference in terms of how many dots are in there or how high or lower they are. And I can tell you that we continue to see a high frequency of intervals in which the price continues to be zero. Next slide, please. This is for the downward direction that is even more insightful because there are way less prices of non-zero values. Next slide, please. This is potentially a simpler way to see the frequency of prices. And here you have the trend of non-zero prices once we have implemented the feature. Yes, we do see a change of pattern. We have seen an increase in the frequency of intervals with non-zero prices, and the colors tell you the price range, right? The majority of the non-zero prices are between $0 and $10 per megawatt. And that's a good direction to go when you see the relative magnitude is still in the lower end. It's typically less than 10%. And next slide, please. This is for the downward direction. As you can see, it's more scattered. We have less prices and non-zero prices. Next slide. And this is some material that we reduced from the previous MPPF because it's important to give this context. Why FRP prices clear at zero? Well, first, we are clearing now in a wider area that has to be transmission feasible, right? We are still enforcing constraints. Now, the nuances are that even though we have the logic, the functionality to enforce transmission constraints, we are not enforcing all the transmission constraints that we are enforcing for energy, only a subset. And this was by design. That was on purpose because it was a very meaningful change, not just in terms of the functionality, but also for the operation, right? Now operators are going to be able to see constraints binding for energy, but potential at the same time binding for regulation for procurement down or flexible capacity up. And it's a change of paradigm. They need to settle on what that means, how to interpret the information, and most importantly for us also to learn from this limited set of constraints, how things are working. If there is something that is not working properly, we have an opportunity to clean it without having all this massive set of constraints binding at the same time. And also the time of the year. When we implemented this in February, it happens to be a good opportunity of the year because that is typically with relatively mild load. We have fewer level of congestion, and even though it's good for implementation, it's not very meaningful to really be able to assess and see the full functionality at play just because of these conditions. And one of the subtle items here that we don't have to forget is that the FRP construct that we currently have is not bid-based. Participants don't bid for FRP. It is based on opportunity cost. And opportunity costs are going to arise only when there is limitation. The opportunity costs arise when you have a resource hitting its maximum capacity, and now the market has to optimize and find the best trade-off between procuring that limited capacity for energy or FRP or any combination between the two. That's when the opportunity cost arises. And when we are not able to procure all the FRP, we kick in this demand curve that is going to signal that, yes, we cannot procure all the FRP and therefore it's scarce. We have a price set by this demand curve. Otherwise, we are able to procure the capacity. We have plenty of resources to be able to meet that, and therefore the price is going to be zero. Next slide, please. Next one. Just as an update, as a reference, since implementation in February 2023, we started enforcing for FRP, specifically FRP, the subset of transmission constraints that we define as base flow gates. These are effectively the thermal limits that we have in physical cables. We are finalizing the functionality and the testing to be able to enforce nomograms. These are more security-based and contingency security-based constraints, more complex with linear relationships. We are expecting, as of now, that we're going to be able to enforce this set of nomograms somewhere in July, most likely mid-July. And after that, we have to do further assessment whether there are merits to enforce also contingency constraints in the market. So next slide, just to give you a color of what this means. On this plot, what you see is the relative proportion of congestion in the real-time market. And this is a very crude approximation. It's a normalized congestion. Effectively, we take the largest level of congestion we see in the last 15, 18 months, and we make that to be 1 per unit. And from there, we just normalize the rest of the congestion. Just to give you a sense of the relative magnitude of the congestion on base constraints or nomograms or contingencies. Right now, if you look at in this 3-bar picture, the only portion that is being enforced for FRP is the dark blue. That happens to be a small portion relative to the whole congestion of the system, and that compounded with the time of the year doesn't give us the full blown of the FRP functionality to really assess how it's working under congestion conditions. Next slide. The last piece may not be that interesting for the market side, but it's also a practical concern that we have to keep in mind, because at the end, we need to ensure that regardless of what features, what functionalities we put in the market, we are able to come with a solution within the time quota that we have, right? In the real time, we don't have all the time to come with a solution like in the day ahead that we can have the luxury to run a little bit longer. In the real time, it's set on a clock. Every 15 minutes, we have to kick in the next run regardless, right? And therefore, we have this hard time window that we have to comply for every run. This is a collection of the distribution of the running times. How long it takes to get a 15-minute market solution out of the system. This is measured in seconds, so the lower end is around 300 seconds. That is about 6 minutes. The upper end can go in the normal distribution around 500 seconds. That would be what, like 8 minutes or so. What you see is that starting in February, we can see that the lower end of the distribution jump or just move up, right? Rather than being just flat 300, it's somewhere higher, anywhere in the range of 350 or so. That just shows you that once we have implemented FRP, there is an implication, there is an impact that is expected that was projected to be in running the market and how long it takes to complete that solution. Maybe a simpler way to visualize this is in the next slide, please, where you can have only the average per day of how long it takes to get a 15-minute market solution. And this clearly shows you the change starting with February 2023. By that time, we were running about 400 seconds on average per run, and then we moved to basically 460 seconds. So the introduction of the FRP with the limited number of constraints increased the running time of the solution by about 1 minute, about 60 seconds. And depending on the day, depending on the season, that time can be higher or lower. And that is one factor that we have to consider when we determine the optimal enforcement of all the constraints. Let me pause here and see if we have any question before I change the topic. And we will have to go relatively quickly because we still have two main sections of the NPPF today. Michelle, Brenda?
No questions at this time.
Okay, let me cover one last topic on FRP quickly. Can we move to the next slide? And that is, with the implementation of the FRP, there was some realignment of the timing, and that effectively resulted in one change to the consequence of the test. We have 3 passes, T75, T55, and T40. Prior to the implementation of the FRP, the last run, the T-40, was considered to be the binding results for passing or failing the test. And with the implementation of the FRP, that changes slightly for only the first interval of every hour. Given the timing that it's not a running time or it's not a computational time, it's just the horizon that we have to consider when we need to have the results by. For the first round of the hour, we need to ensure that we are still on time, and that means that we need to rely on the results of the T55, that is the second pass, again, only for the first interval. That was an item that was identified basically the first day when we went live and the implications of that. And we have seen that there is some implications, and how meaningful that implication is for participants is going to be shown in the next slide. That is one of the items that we have. We also have other items. We have seen, for instance, at the very beginning of the FRP functionality that we saw some very tiny negative FRP values that we have addressed. We identify another issue where for storage resources, the energy limitation was not being considered. That was already addressed. And we currently have an enhancement going through the works to ensure that we can come with a correction for the calculation of the FRP demand curves. Right now, they are being built with prices that are too low. And we are expecting that this could be put in place somewhere in July. Now, specific to the first item, I have 2 slides to share. Next slide, please. And that is, if now the T55 is the binding result to determine whether an entity passed or failed, how is that impactful instead of using the T-40? And there could be different combinations, right? So T55 versus T40. You can be passing at T55 and you may fail at T40. You may be passing at 55 and continue to pass at T40. You may fail at T55 and you have taken actions to cure that and be able to pass in the T40. Or you fail in T55 and now you fail in T40. Any of these combinations could be a change of consequence given this rule that now we have to rely on the T55 for the first interval. Here, this plot shows all these combinations, and I would say the most meaningful material one is when at T55, an entity failed the test, took actions to be able to cure that failure, and now at T40, it was able to pass it. However, we already took the solution of T55 that is a failure, and now it's locked for the real-time market. That, I would say, is the most meaningful combination out of all these permutations that I just explained. And here you have how frequently that has happened, broken out by a specific EIM entity. If you see in this breakdown, I would say the most meaningful or direct impact is the one that is from fail to pass. That is the gray one, because that is the one that now the participant, even though it was able to cure the failure, is still subject to the failure consequence. And this is done for the upward test, and the next slide is for the downward test. Next slide, please. And we also have the same metrics for the capacity test, and for space we didn't include this here, but it's not that dramatically different to the metrics that you see here. That's all what we have for this topic. Now, given the timing that is basically 11:10 and this session is running through noon, and there are still 2 main sessions for this discussion, I will suggest to basically stop the market update section here so that we can really move to the policy update. Brenda, are we good with that?
Yeah, Guillermo, we can go ahead and move to the next few topics and come back if we have time to your topic, if that's something we can do, or we can just go ahead and go over one more topic.
No, I think we can stop here so we can really have meaningful time for the other topics. If there are any questions based on the material that is available in the deck, we will be happy to address those offline.
Great. Thanks, Guillermo. So yeah, we will go ahead and move on to the policy update. And for today's policy update, we do have Alicia Craig Arnold, who will be covering for Jillian, and we will go ahead and proceed with the policy update. So Alicia, can we confirm your audio?
Thanks, Brenda. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. I will be filling in for Jillian today, who is unable to be here today, and I'll be giving this presentation in her place. So I'll try to move quickly so that we have time for Guillermo to finish the rest of his presentation, but I'll be giving a brief overview of the status of each of our current policy initiatives and just a preview of some of the upcoming steps for these initiatives. I believe we have 16 current policy initiatives, so again, I'll try to not spend too much time on each individual initiative. And just as a reminder, most of this information, especially with our schedules, can be found on our policy initiatives page on our website. So I'll start off here with the stakeholder working groups that will be convening this summer that will be informing development of some issue papers and straw proposals for new initiatives. So starting off with the Greenhouse Gas Coordination Working Groups, the ISO is just about to begin a series of working group meetings to really continue the evolution of the greenhouse gas accounting framework in EDM and WIM. And we're starting off with a working group survey on topics and problem statements. We're requesting that stakeholders complete that by tomorrow, June 30, and then we'll be beginning to host stakeholder workshops this summer. And those have the goal of kind of getting to alignment and on the problem statements and issues before we really launch the initiative early next year. And you can see the graphic down here with kind of a rough outline of where we're starting off with this. Next slide, please. And then the next working group here is the gas management working groups. So we'll also be launching working groups for gas management to try to start revisiting the existing gas resource participation options and identifying possible solutions here. These working groups will also start taking place this summer and extend into the fall. And like I mentioned, with the Greenhouse Gas Coordination Working Groups, they're really intended to kind of help inform the development of issue papers and straw proposals and identify the scope and the priorities of the initiative early on. Next slide, please. Moving on to our more current initiatives, I'm going to start with the WIM Resource Efficiency Evaluation Enhancements, Phase 2. And the scope of this initiative here was well, a few things. I'm creating a WIM Assistance Energy Transfer product, as well as adjusting RSC obligations to account for low priority exports, and then developing new rules requiring low priority exports purchased in the CAISO market to be e-tagged as firm provisional. The status here is the CAISO Board of Governors and WIM governing body approved the final proposal for this initiative last December. Tariff language was developed this spring, and for granted approval of the tariff revisions in May. So implementation is planned for next week, July 1, and I think that's all I have for that initiative. Moving on. Another initiative that's mostly wrapped up, Capacity Procurement Mechanism Track 1. This scope was fairly limited. It was intended to address 5 relatively straightforward CPM operational and process enhancements. This was approved by the CAISO Board of Governors at their March meeting, and we have implementation planned for the 3rd quarter of this year. We've now moved on to CPM Track 2. Next slide, please. And the scope of CPM Track 2 is to really re-examine the current CPM soft offer cap. Right now, the ISO tariff requires that we open a stakeholder initiative every 4 years to examine this. And the last time this occurred was May of 2019, which was 4 years ago. So This initiative will be considering whether the soft offer cap should be updated based on CEC provided figures using the ISO tariff defined methodology. And this is, again, fairly limited in scope, so any topics related to improvements of the soft offer cap or other CPM processes are not in the scope of Track 2, and we'll be addressing those in future CPM initiatives. The status of Track 2 is that we kicked that off with a stakeholder meeting in May. The straw proposal for this will be posted tomorrow. And we're planning on a draft final proposal for September and hopefully taking this to the Board of Governors for approval next winter, although we do not have a date determined for that yet. Next up, we've got energy storage enhancements, and this was generally to kind of develop market enhancements to dispatch energy storage resources. This had a pretty wide-ranging scope here, and we've spent a long time on this. I'm not going to kind of go through the laundry list here, especially since this was approved by the CAISO board and WEIM governing body in last December. Tariff language was developed this spring and just received approval by FERC earlier this month. We have implementation for most of these changes planned for this July, and we're calling this Track 1. And then Track 2 changes are expected for implementation this fall, and those are limited to regulation awards on storage resources state of charge. And I'm just going to pause here real quick because I know I've kind of flown through these first few initiatives. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Otherwise, I will continue on.
No questions at this time.
Great. All right, moving on to the Ancillary Service State of Charge Constraint Initiative. This initiative was developed kind of as a follow-up to the CAISO's September 2022 tariff amendment pertaining to the AS storage requirement, and it will addresses compensation for storage resources that are providing ancillary services, and is looking at solutions to reduce uplift payments that can result from the current ancillary service state of charge constraint and big cost recovery rules. This initiative is still in the early stages. Right now, we're just targeting a straw proposal for the third quarter of 2023, and it's classified as a joint CAISO board and WEIM governing body item. But we don't have any further goals or items on the calendar right now for that, so it's still in the early stages here. Moving on to day-ahead market enhancements. STAME is mostly starting to wrap up here. So STAME, of course, was the initiative to create the new imbalance reserve product in the IFM to procure flexible reserves. This item, or this initiative, was approved by the board and WEIM governing body in May. And tariff development has been taking place since May with and anticipating FERC filing in mid-August. That will hopefully coincide with the FERC filing for the next item, EDAM. Next slide, please. The Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative was approved in February by the CAISO board and WEIM governing body, with, again, tariff language being developed since that time, with the goal of going to FERC for filing in mid-August as well. Thank you. Next up, we've got transmission services and market scheduling priorities. This is phase 2 of this initiative. Generally, this one is addressing the process for wheeling transactions through the CAISO BA to establish market scheduling priority. The final proposal for this initiative was approved by the CAISO board and WEIM governing body back in February. with again more tariff language being developed this spring. Tariff language for track 1 is currently being developed with the goal of a mid-July FERC filing. Track 1 is addressing available transfer capacity in short-term wheeling, with track 2 addressing long-term wheeling and upgrades. And the goal for that is a tariff filing with FERC in January of 2024. So that has not yet started, but will be starting following filing for track 1. Next up is price formation enhancements. And this one is a pretty wide-ranging initiative. So we split this up into kind of 3 broad phases, starting with phase 1, which we're anticipating will include scarcity pricing enhancements, BAA level market power mitigation, and analysis of fast start pricing in the CAISO markets. And then phase 2 and 3, which are starting a little bit farther down the line, will likely include a review of market pricing for flexible resources for phase 2. And then phase 3 will have a review of multi-interval optimization impacts on storage resources, as well as market changes to facilitate real-time co-optimization of ancillary services. In terms of the status of this initiative, we released an issue paper last summer, and we're just starting to pick this initiative up again. So starting with an update call that was held earlier this week. As we detailed in that update call, we'll be starting weekly working group meetings starting in early August on phase 1 topics. And the goal there with, as with the other working group meetings, is to kind of start identifying policy direction and informing the phase 1 straw proposal that we're planning to release approximately the last quarter of 2023. Like I mentioned, phase 2 and 3, we don't have a timeline for yet, but those are anticipated to begin in 2024 with working group meetings and then extending through 2025, but we won't have a more specific timeline on those until we're a little farther into the development of phase 1. Moving on to market parameter change enhancements. This initiative was addressing the minimum shift factor used in CAISO market and procuring the procedure for changing penalty prices. The final proposal for this initiative was approved by the board and governing body in March, and a FERC tariff amendment filing was made at the end of May. Moving on to EDAM ISO BAA participation rules. This initiative consists of 3 tracks, which we're calling A1, A2, and B right now, and generally is addressing the ISO BAA specific elements required for EDAM participation. The scope for track A1 is listed in these bullet points here and is developing the criteria to set the ISO BAA's net EDAM export transfer constraint, a interim solution for allocating ISO BAA RSC failure surcharges and revenues, transfer resource settlement and transfer revenue distribution, and then the process for recovering historical wheeling access charge revenues. We posted a straw proposal for track A1 in May, and we're planning to post the draft final proposal for this on July 13. And then following an opportunity for stakeholder feedback, the final proposal and draft tariff language are planned for August. And the current plan is to take this track A1 to the board in September for approval. We have not started developing schedules for track A2 and B yet. Those will probably come out once we've finalized track A1. Moving on to the WIM base schedule submission deadline. This is a new and fairly straightforward initiative. This is a proposal to revise the WIM base schedule submission to withdraw an enhancement that was approved back in 2020 to create a new WIM RSC evaluation at 30 minutes prior to the hour, since it was determined to be infeasible within the market solution time. So the proposal for this was posted earlier this month, and should be going to the CAISO board and WIM governing body in July for approval. Next is generation deliverability methodology review. This initiative we propose to kind of respond to industry concerns about access to deliverability for resources seeking to compete in the procurement processes, and we'll just generally be assessing the ISO's deliverability assessment methodology. And status of this initiative is we had an issue paper published earlier this month. We anticipate publishing a straw proposal later in July, a draft final proposal in September, and hopefully taking this to the CAISO Board of Governors in the winter. I'm sure an exact date for that yet, and this will be proceeding kind of in parallel with the Interconnection Process Enhancements Initiative, which I'll cover in a couple more slides. Next, we've got the Rules of Conduct Enhancements, Track 1. This is another new initiative. This will be addressing some necessary changes to the ISO's ISO tariffs rules of conduct. We just kicked off Track 1, which will be focused on kind of a couple more time-sensitive topics, mostly meter data penalties. And then we've got Track 2 addressing some items that will benefit from more extensive stakeholder engagement. So those include specifying information submission requirements, subject to tariff required information penalties, updating penalty tolling eligibility, late forced outage reporting penalties, and penalty structure for DR customer load baseline monitoring data. Track 1 started off with a stakeholder workshop earlier this month. We're targeting a straw proposal for early July, I believe July 5, with a draft final proposal in August, and hopefully going to the board and WIM governing body for decision in September. Following that, Track 2 will begin with stakeholder workshops, but we have not identified dates for that right now. That'll be determined after Track 1 goes to the board. And then I think this is our last initiative here, Interconnection Process Enhancements. This is broadly an initiative intending to enhance ISO generators. Generator interconnection and deliverability allocation procedures. Track 1 was approved by the ISO board in May and is focused on more immediate adjustments to the Cluster 15 study schedule and out-of-state wind. And then Track 2 is addressing additional reforms to the interconnection queuing process and some more targeted modifications. An issue paper for Track 2 was released in May, and we'll be having stakeholder workshops taking place over the summer to develop some principles and problem statements to inform the development of a straw proposal. And right now we're targeting a board decision for December of 2023. I think that is the last initiative on my list. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a question from Shenyu. Shenyu, go ahead and ask your quick question if you can.
This is Chenyu from PG&E. I have a question about the announcement about the ASSOC and the CPM phase 1. So first question is the ASSOC, we know that this summer we work on that. It's going to go live in July 1st. It's another ASSOC initiative coming up from implementation standpoint.
So you're asking if there's another initiative beginning?
Yes.
Yes, this is one that we're that I was describing, and we're just starting to kick that off.
So is that how does it relate to the one we just going live, like about to go live for July 1st?
To be honest, I'm not sure. That would be a better question for the policy lead on that, but we're in the very early stages of this, so I don't think we've developed a firm scope for this yet.
Okay, thank you. And the second question is the CPM. You say the phase 1 looks like the plan to implement in the fall of this year, and has that policy team have the commitment from CAISO PMO? Because I do not see that on the summary release.
You're asking about the implementation date?
I thought you announced that. That's why I'm curious, because it's not, it has some discrepancy as what I saw on the CAISO release schedule.
The information I have here is the latest that we have from our policy team. There might have been a lack of coordination there with getting that updated.
Okay, thank you. And then I do have one last question and maybe a request. Since this meeting, this is not for you, Alyssa, this is for the event coordinator. Since like this meeting, we're always in a rush, and when it comes to policy and implementation, the material it went through really fast, and we feel there's no time for any questions. And we give this feedback in the last call, and I hope the CAISO really take into consideration how much material you're going to cover and how much time you will need, since like we're rushing through here. Thank you.
Yeah, we will go ahead and take that feedback and work on the next meeting. So quarter 3, we will expect a hybrid schedule, but I'll go over that later. But let's go ahead and pass it on to Trang.
Thank you, Brenda. Good morning, everyone. I'm Trang Bose from the Project Management Division in the ISO, here to provide a release plan update. So for those that are familiar with this, we did present the material in the Release User Group Forum that was on June 27. And normally we have that forum every 2 weeks, and that is published on the CAISO.com calendar. So some of this content may be familiar from that last update to you. So what I will do is cover the most significant updates and go through the presentation and highlight those. And then at the end, we'll stop for questions. Okay. All right, so in the release plan summary, there are not significant changes. So we do have our summer release that is activating for trade date July 1st, which is Saturday. And for fall release, the scope of that has not changed. So we have the 4 initiatives there. We have some some independent releases that have been on the radar in the release plan updates for some time. And then we have some upcoming initiatives in 2024 that we've also been covering as part of the normal release user group updates. So before I move on to the individual releases, I wanted to address one question about CPM track 1. So the question that came up in the policy coverage of that was the alignment between the policy activities and the implementation release plan. So for CPM enhancements track 1, there are policy activities and stakeholder activities that are happening. From the implementation perspective, we do not anticipate the software changes with the Q3 target of the CPM enhancements implementation. So the scope of that is BPM and tariff updates. That's why we haven't spent a lot of time covering that in the release plan updates, but nonetheless, it is relevant, and we will include that in the release plan summary to call out and track the BPM and tariff changes for CPM, but just know that we are not anticipating software changes. So that hopefully addresses the question and comment raised about CPM. So I just want to stop on that point and just see if there's additional questions on that. All right. So I'm not hearing anything, and Brenda or Michelle, please let me know if you see any other comments. So let's go on to summer, and I'll highlight some changes and significant updates there. So on the summer release overview, the BRS for RSEE Phase 2, that includes tracks 1, 2, and 3, has been published. So version 1.2 is available and does include a clarification for track 1, as well as some additional updates for tracks 2 and 3. And then when we go to settlements, yesterday we did deploy the settlements changes for the summer release and publish the final settlement config output file. So that is complete. And then for production activation, everything is set for trade date July 1st. So before we leave this slide, for ASSOCC, I wanted to also address the comment that came up in the policy discussion. So what we are implementing for ASSOCC for July 1st is, again, going to be the changes that were filed and approved by FERC for the tariff changes. So that will be in effect and retroactive to September 20th, 2022 and onward. There is a proposal that is planned to be published in Q3 for ASSOCC. So first, we are still planning, as Alyssa mentioned, to have a stakeholder process to review the implementation that we are still putting in place for July 1st, retroactive to September 20th, 2022, to see if there are additional changes that will be needed for that solution that we've already implemented for ASSOCC. So I think just to summarize again, our implementation for 7.1 for ancillary service state of charge will continue as planned, and then the stakeholder process will happen to review that solution and identify potential additional changes. And so hopefully that helps clarify a little bit those two tracks. And again, the stakeholder process for ASSOCC, it's normally would have happened, of course, earlier than the implementation, but we did have an urgent FERC filing that that bypassed the normal stakeholder process. Okay, all right. So, so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so for energy storage enhancements, we can go forward again. There's one slide that I want to call out here, so let's move advance forward. And let's do one more. And then, okay, so actually one thing to call out here. So for the BPM changes for market operations, that PRR is still in progress. So we did have some later changes to update the market operations PRR with what we are currently planning for July 1st. And that includes the expectation for the attenuation factors, or the AS multipliers, which, as we announced previously, for July 1st, those attenuation factors will be 0. And for the PRR for market operations, that includes all the changes, as well as for ASSOCC, that's planned to publish by next week. So stay tuned for that. And then let's go to one other slide, the next slide, please. Okay, so this is what I wanted to call out. So for summer, we initially were planning changes for these 3 items: the regulation award clarifications, bidding requirements for AS, as well as DEV enhancements. Recently, earlier this month, we did decide to not activate the regulation award clarifications for the expected impact from regulation and state of charge. So that will not activate until further notice. And so how we're going to keep that inactive is by setting those attenuation factors and multipliers to 0 until further notice. Okay, that's a big highlight there. And then the other functionality will remain or will be activated for July 1st as expected. So let's go on to the next initiative here. Or I'm sorry, this is just a, yes, that's, so for RSEE, we can go to the milestone slide, please. All right. Okay, so this one, again, the BRS is available for some for additional review. And for this one, thank you, Guillermo and the team, for clarifying the assistance energy transfer changes and the ISO's plans and methods for communicating the assistance energy transfer opting in and opting out, as well as the process for our participants to make their changes. So, so that assistance energy transfer discussion was relevant to what we are activating as of trade date July 1st, and we currently do have, even though the ISO is not opting in for AET for trade date July 1st through the 5th, we do have other entities that are have opted in starting trade date July 1st. So that process is very much, in place and effective and being used right now. So, so that's just a quick update there. So we can go on to the next initiative. All right. So for hybrid resources 2C settlements, this one is all set to go for TIGEN resources. So no other significant updates here. So let's go to ASSOCC. Okay, so for ASSOCC, I did talk through again what we're implementing, and then also how that ties into the stakeholder process that's expected to kick off in Q3 of this year for 2023. One other deployment and activation implementation nuance for this that's important to communicate is that, again, for ASSOCC starting July 1st onward, then the settlements and CMRI data will be processed as normal for those prospective trade dates. And for retroactive data from September 20th, 2022 through June 30, 2023, we will be loading that retroactive data into settlements and CMRI for the month of July. So even though we referenced the ISO settlements calendar here, not all of the statements that we'll be publishing in July will have the ASSOCC changes. So I know that was a question that came up, was we have, a June 2023 T9 recalc that's publishing on July 3rd, and will that have the ASSOCC changes? Not necessarily, because that data for that trade date might not be loaded in the system yet. So the expectation is going to be that after August, we'll have all that retroactive data loaded, and from August onward, then any of the runs after that from settlements will include the ASSOCC changes. Okay, all right. So let's go on to the fall release. Okay, so for the fall release, the most significant update here is going to be the BRS that I mentioned for RSEE. And then another highlight for technical specifications is that we are working through the technical specifications for the fall. And we have a technical user group on July 11, where we do expect to start covering the technical specs published for fall. I think we're anticipating that OASIS will be the first one that will be covered in TUG, and we'll continue to provide additional tech spec updates in that forum as well. So that's a good milestone to keep in mind, and a good forum to stay tuned to for the technical details of this implementation. All right, and for fall, I think this summarizes the system changes. So it's just a good point of reference for what to expect for system impacts. So let's go to, actually for the rest of the fall, I don't have significant updates on milestones. So I think we can go ahead and shift to the next release section. All right, so independent. We don't have new independent efforts here. I think that we have the hybrid resources 2C RIMS that's still planned for this year. And then I think the last one that we have after this is going to be the URL and IP changes that are in map stage now that will require some cutover in production also the end of this year. So no changes to this, just more a reminder that from the technical perspective that we are going to change URLs and IPs. Let's go on to, I think that's the end of the independent, and then we can go on to the future releases. Let's go to this. Okay, so I think this may be the last project slide that I'll cover. Is we have the future releases overview here that, again, aligns with the milestones that Alyssa already covered. So you'll see that the board is complete for all of these. The tariff activities are listed here. Then the next milestones coming, and major milestones coming up will be, again, the filing of the tariff for DAM and EDAM in August. And for summer 2024, we do have RSEE Phase 2 Track 3 planned, and then transmission service and market scheduling priorities. And then for fall, we'll have implementation of DAME and EDAM and the EDAM onboarding for spring 2025. Okay. And I think we have for reference the slides for the individual initiatives, but I won't cover those in detail. So I think we can go to the closing slide of my section, Brenda. And then we can open it up for any questions. All right, Brenda or Michelle, do you have any questions or comments? See any questions or comments?
I don't have any questions and comments. Michelle, go ahead and change me to presenter on the other one, but Trang, I know you mentioned July 11th, just a reminder, I think, is that meeting still happening for RUG or is it July 25th?
Oh, I'm sorry, thank you. The next RUG will be the 25th and the next technical user group will be the 18th. So thank you for that clarification, yes.
And I do see Chen Yu, she just raised her hand. Go ahead, Chen Yu, ask your very quick question if you can.
Can you hear me okay? So given that the next RUG is going to be canceled and we will not have the next one until July 25th. So one question I have is for energy storage, because the regulation SOC is off the scope for the summer. And will we, how will we know whether that is going to be in the full scope prior to the 25th? Or shall we expect a decision by the CAISO by the, before 25th of July?
So, Chen Yu, I can assure you that at this point, we do not have a plan to activate the SOC piece or the attenuation factors before the fall. That's the current plan, is that it wouldn't be before fall. And then we can share more at the RUG on the 25th. Is there some urgency that your organization had before the 25th?
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking, okay, if it is going in for the fall, we are after the summer, we are starting to gear up to review the DRS again for the fall. And currently the last update for energy storage is in May. And so if regulation SOC going into the fall, so I anticipate CAISO will have an update for the BRQ or the BRS. And we would like to know, sooner the better, because when we wait till July 25th, then we get the announcement, we see the update. This is going to take it all the way to mid-August. Then again, since we do not really have the market stem time frame established, I just thinking, trying just to look ahead there to avoid some last minute crunch time. Thank you.
Understood. Thank you for that. I will say that for energy storage enhancements for the version of the BRS that is out there for track 2, that scope is still, of course, intended. And so I think that you can be certain that that scope should not change. And then so by the 25th, we'll give an update on the deferred piece from the summer. And then if the BRS is updated before then, or we have some decision, then we can send a separate announcement prior to the RUG on the 25th.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. Brenda, you?
Thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Appreciate everyone's participation. At this time, we have covered the majority of these topics. We are aware that our team has not been able to cover a few topics, but we will do our very best to give that time for another time to follow up. But there's a lot of material in the slides. The updated version of the slides will be posted after this meeting. We did add a few little links in there, but feel free to click on those PDF files to view links on the Market Performance and Planning Forum. As well, just a reminder, we definitely take your feedback for this upcoming meeting. So knowing that if we do anticipate a lot of topics for the market performance, we will do our best to kind of extend the time to give stakeholders time to ask questions, but also feel free to utilize the chat to submit questions to us, and we could actually answer them right away through chat or even answer it throughout the presentation. So definitely encourage that as well. And also, as a reminder, for policy initiative, we don't really go over exactly everything within this forum. So our best is that you attend those stakeholder process meetings that are scheduled throughout for each initiative. So those ones are listed on the ISO calendar as well. So our policy leads are on top of that if there's any detailed questions you may have. So now we currently still have standing on the 21st for our next upcoming stakeholder, upcoming Market Performance and Planning Forum. If any questions do come up or scheduling, we do consider any feedback from our stakeholders in terms of moving dates around. So we are doing our very best to make sure we don't overlap. And as well, we are anticipating an increase of more meetings. So any feedback you may have, we'll do our very best in our team to give those. And our last slide we would like to present for today's meeting is just the energy blog, was just posted recently on the 9th on the summer readiness. So this is a great blog prepared from the CAISO team, and definitely look into that if you like, but also the data and everything information that we provide on these slides are also linked in to various locations within the CAISO website. So I really definitely want to give a great thanks to the team here who participated in presenting, and I appreciate everyone's participation and feedback. So we really appreciate what we can do for the next upcoming quarterly meeting. But at this time, I do have a few more minutes. If there's any last remainder questions anyone would like to raise, this is a good opportunity. If not, we will go ahead and close our meeting around, at this time, but just waiting to see if there's any questions.
I do not see any questions on the phone-only line or on WebEx at this time.
Great. Thanks so much, Michelle. I appreciate your help. And thanks so much for everyone in the teams that participate at the ISO. And we look forward to seeing you guys at the next upcoming meeting in September, and look forward to those meetings, invites for different meetings that are for the stakeholder process. A lot of them will be happening, but like we said, we will do our best and those working groups to kick things off for initiatives. And so thanks so much for everyone who participated today. All right, Michelle, we could go ahead and close our call.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.